Okay, we're ready for our third reading of the BFG. Directly in front of them, lying against the side of the mountain, Sophie could see a massive round stone. It was as big as a house. The giant reached out and rolled the stone to one side as easily as if it had been a football. And now, where the stone had been, there appeared a vast black hole. The hole was so large the giant didn't even have to duck his head as he went in. He strode into the black hole, still carrying Sophie in one hand, the trumpet and suitcase in the other. As soon as he was inside, he stopped and turned and rolled the great stone back into place so that the entrance to his cave was completely hidden from outside. Now that the entrance had been sealed up, there was not a glint of light inside the cave. All was black. Sophie felt herself being lowered to the ground, and then the giant let go of the blanket completely. His footsteps moved away. Sophie sat there in the dark, shivering with fear. "He is getting ready to eat me," she told herself. "He will probably eat me raw, just as I am, or perhaps he will boil me first, or he will have me fried. He will drop me like a rasher of bacon into a gigantic frying pan sizzling with fat." A blaze of light suddenly lit up the whole place. Sophie blinked and stared. And here's what she saw. She saw an enormous cavern with a high rocky roof. The walls on either side were lined with shelves, and on the shelves there stood row upon row of glass jars. There were jars everywhere. They were piled up in the corners. They filled every nook and cranny of the cave. In the middle of the floor there was a table 12 feet high and a chair to match. The giant took off his black cloak and hung it against the wall. Sophie saw that under the cloak he was wearing a sort of collarless shirt and a dirty old leather waistcoat that didn't seem to have any buttons. His trousers were faded green and were far too short in the legs. On his bare feet he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals, that for some reason had holes cut along each side, with a large hole at the end where his toes stuck out. Sophie, crouching on the floor of the cave in her nightie, gazed back at him through thick, steel-rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind, and a finger of ice was running up and down the length of her spine. "Ha!" shouted the giant, walking forward and rubbing his hands together. "What has we got here?" His booming voice rolled around the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. The BFG. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. "Now he is really going to eat me," Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inwards and outwards from his head as he wished. "I is hungry," the giant boomed. He grinned and showing his massive square teeth. The teeth were very white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like huge slices of white bread. Please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter. "Ha! Just because I is a giant, you think I is a man-gobbling cannibal," he shouted. "You is about right. Giants is all cannibally and murderful, and they does gobble up human beings. We is in giant country now. Giants is everywhere around. Out there, us has the famous bone-crunching giant. Bone-crunching giant crunches up 2 wopsy-whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear-bursting. Noise of crunching bones goes crackety-crack for miles around." "Ouch," Sophie said. "Bone-crunching giant only gobbles human beings from Turkey." And the giant said, "Every night, Bone Cruncher is galloping off to Turkey to gobble Turks." Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by the remark that she became quite angry. "Why Turks?" she blurted out. "What's wrong with the English?" "Bone-crunching giant says Turks is tasting ever so much juicier and more scrumptious. Bone Cruncher says Turkish human beings has a glamourly flavor. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of turkey. I suppose they would, Sophie said. Of course they would, the giant shouted. Every human being is diddly and different. Some is scrumptiddlyumptious and some is ucky slush. Greeks is full of ucky slush. No giant is eating Greeks ever. Why not? Sophie asked. Greeks from Greece is all tasting greasy, the giant said. I imagine that's possible too, Sophie said. She was wondering with a bit of tremble what all the talking about eating people was leading up to. Whatever happened, she simply must play along with this peculiar giant and smile at his jokes. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just working up an appetite by talking about food. As I am saying, the giant went on, all human beings is having different flavors. Human beings from Panama is tasting very strongly of hats. Why hats? Sophie said. You is not very clever, the giant said, moving his great ears in and out. I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than a boondoggle. Do you like vegetables? Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation. And here's a picture of Sophie on the table talking to the BFG. Turn the page. She was hoping to steer the conversation towards a slightly less dangerous kind of food. You is trying to change the subject, the giant said sternly. We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of human beings. The human beings is not a vegetable. Oh, but the bean is a vegetable, Sophie said. Not the human being, the giant said. The human being has 2 legs and a vegetable has no legs at all. Sophie didn't argue anymore. The last thing she wanted to do was to make the giant cross. The human being, the giant went on, is coming in dillions of different flavors. For instance, human beings from Wales is tasting very whooshy of fish. There's something very fishy about Wales. You mean Wales, W-H-A-L-E-S, Sophie said. Wales, W-A-L-E-S, is something quite different. Wales is Wales, the giant said. Don't gobble funk around with words. I will now give you another example. Human beings from Jersey has a most disgustable woolly tickle on the tongue, the giant said. Human beings from Jersey is tasting of cardigan sweaters. You mean jerseys, Sophie said. You are once again gobbledly funking, the giant shouted. Don't do it. This is a serious and snitching subject. May I continue? Please do, Sophie said. Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much of dogs, the giant went on. Of course, Sophie said, the taste of Great Danes. Wrong, cried the giant, slapping his thigh. Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because they is tasting of Labradors. Then what do the people of Labrador taste of? Sophie said. Danes, the giant cried triumphantly. Great Danes. Aren't you getting things a bit mixed up? Sophie said. I is a very mixed up giant, the giant said, but I does do my best, and I is not nearly as mixed up as the other giants. I know one who gallops all the way to Wellington for his supper. Wellington, Sophie said. Where is Wellington? Your head is full of squash flies, the giant said. Wellington is in New Zealand. The human beings in Wellington has an especially scrumptiddlyumptious taste. So says the welly-eating giant. What do the people of Wellington taste of? Sophie asked. Boots, the giant said. Of course, Sophie said. I should have known. Sophie decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather get it over with right away than to be kept hanging around any more. What sort of human beings do you eat? She asked, trembling. Me, shouted the giant, his mighty voice making up the glass jars rattle on the shelves. Me gobbling up human beings? This I never. The others, yes, all the others is gobbling them up every night, but not me. I is a freaky giant. I is a nice and jumbly giant. I is the only nice and jumbly giant in giant country. I is the big friendly giant. I is the BFG. What is your name? Oh, what is your name? My name is Sophie, Sophie said, hardly daring to believe the good news that she had just heard. He is the big, friendly giant.